This is Learning Coherence, a series about professional learning plans, how they get built, what holds them together, and what happens when the architecture underneath them is made visible. This series is about professional learning plans, how they get built, what holds them together, and what happens when the architecture underneath them is made visible. If you lead professional learning in a school, you've written these plans. You know the components: goals, theories of change, theories of action, logic models, evidence frameworks. You've sat in the rooms where they get built, and you've probably had the experience of picking one up a year later and realizing that the connections you remember making, the reasoning, the trade-offs, the "here's why we chose this" conversations, aren't actually in the document. They were in the room. They left when the people left. I've spent 23 years in international schools across 4 countries working on this, as a classroom teacher, a coach, and now as someone who designs systems that connect curriculum, professional learning, and coaching. Over the past several years, I've been building an applied system called Learning Coherence. It supports the full life cycle of professional learning planning, from initial context through plan generation, competency mapping, stakeholder consultation, participatory decision-making, and impact evaluation. It generates stakeholder communication variants. It runs governance processes with full decision traceability. It monitors implementation over multi-year timelines. And there are features I'm still building. What I want to do in this series is go deep on the thinking underneath it. Not a feature tour, a thinking tour. Each chapter focuses on one piece of the architecture, the research behind it, the design decisions I made, and why it matters. By the end, you'll have a clear picture of what connected architecture looks like and what it makes possible. I should tell you what sits underneath this system because it matters. And honestly, I want to say it because I'm proud of the stitching. This isn't built on one framework. It's built on 14. And the real design work, the part that took years, was figuring out how they fit together. Guskey's 5 levels of professional development evaluation, Killion's CBAM framework, and her evidence methodology. Learning Forward's 11 standards for professional learning across all 3 frames: conditions, processes, and content. Weiss's theory of change methodology with explicit causal chains. Patton's utilization-focused evaluation, the idea that evidence should be gathered with the intent and capacity to actually use it for decisions. The concerns-based adoption model and innovation configuration maps for tracking implementation fidelity. Fixsen's implementation science. Mayne's contribution analysis. Marzano's taxonomy and Bloom's revised taxonomy for cognitive complexity. Fogg's behavioral model, the Cynefin framework for navigating complexity, and the OECD DAC evaluation criteria. That's a lot of names. But none of these frameworks were adopted for decoration. Each one solves a specific structural problem in the planning architecture. Each one earned its place because I kept running into the same gap. This part of the plan needs something that the other frameworks don't provide. And here's the thing. These frameworks exist. They're published. They're well established. But in practice, they almost always live in separate books on separate shelves. A school might know Guskey. They've read Killion. They've written a theory of change. They might even know Patton. But these live as separate exercises done at separate times by separate people. The theory of change is in one document. The evaluation framework is in another. The implementation plan lives somewhere else entirely. The stakeholder consultation happens in a meeting that nobody connects back to any of it. What I kept asking was, what if these weren't separate exercises? What if the theory of change actually connected to the evaluation framework, which connected to the goals, which connected to the evidence plan, which connected to the implementation monitoring, which connected to the stakeholder governance process, not as a concept, structurally. So you could trace the chain. So that methodology provenance was tracked. You could see exactly which framework informed each construct in the plan. That's what Learning Coherence does. It takes research and methodology from across these 14 traditions and connects them into a single architecture where every component traces to every other component. I didn't invent any of the underlying ideas. Guskey's levels are Guskey's. Killion's CBAM is Killion's. Patton's utilization-focused approach is Patton's. Weiss's theory of change methodology is Weiss's. What I built is the connective tissue, the architecture that makes them work together instead of sitting in separate binders gathering dust. And honestly, that's what practitioners do. We read the research. We sit with it for years. We try to make it work in real schools with real constraints and real people who have real limits on their time and attention. And somewhere in that process, the pieces start talking to each other in ways the original authors may not have intended, but that makes sense when you're standing in a school trying to make all of it hold together. That's the work, not any single framework, the connections between them. Let's get into it.